Okay, everybody, welcome. Welcome to this webinar, which is the official launch of the new book, Religion, Conflict and Global Society, a Festschrift celebrating Mark Juergensmeyer. My name is Isak Svensson, and it was Mona Kanwal-Sheikh and myself who took the initiative and has been acting as editors of this book. And we are here to celebrate Mark, a pioneer in the study of religion, conflict, and global society. And it was quite amazing when we reached out to the 22 leading scholars who are part of this book. We received an overwhelming positive and even enthusiastic response. This book is organized around three major themes, and we will have some contributors from the themes to talk to you today about their contribution. And the three themes are religious violence, peace, conflict and terrorism, and global studies. And these are three scholarly fields in which Mark has made a lasting contribution. The last years, Mark has been involved in a research project which I has led and which is coming out from Uppsala University with the name Resolving Jihadist Conflict, Religion, Civil Wars and Prospects for Peace. And it's a research project that brings together different scholars to try to understand how jihadist armed conflicts can be peacefully resolved. And Mark has been a key contributor to this project in the core group, member of the core group, and he has been writing on his book that is being launched later this year or at the beginning of the next, which focusing on how to end cosmic wars. Mark, you're a person whose humor, curiosity, deep knowledge and ability to connect to people, not only on an intellectual level, but also on a human level, is a great source of inspiration. And we are many people who consider you not only a great scholar, but also a good friend. Mona.
Thank you so much, Isak. I just want to start by showing you the book, which just came from the publisher today. We didn't get to distribute it yet, but here you can see that it's a real book with a lot of contributions, 22 contributions in honor of Mark Juergensmeyer. So the book that we're launching today, it's not only a celebration of Mark and his achievements, but also a collection of essays with an extraordinary set of authors that engage with some of the concepts or ideas or even disciplinary fields that Mark has inspired or developed or nuanced in some way. So we have authors who will elaborate a bit on the cosmic warfare concept, on secularism, religion, the field of global studies, terrorism research, Sikh studies, peace and conflict studies, and the list could just go on. Because Mark's, as Isak said, Mark's contributions are really wide and really remarkable. So as Isak and I have written in the introduction of the book, when we started compiling it and reaching out to potential authors, we were really struck by the remarkable globality of Mark's reach, because not only has he contributed to the globalization of the scholarship on global studies, but also, of course, to the global or conflict studies field and the religious violence field, but also through his own way of conducting scholarship. He has shown how to work in a way that truly connects and involves people from around the world and across the world. So if you get a chance to download the book from the DIIS website, you will see that the scholars contributing to the book represent a variety of cultural, geographical contexts that have, of course, also impacted on Mark's scholarship. Another thing that we found really amazing when we started this project was the transdisciplinarity of Mark's work. Not only the interdisciplinarity, but the transdisciplinarity, which I think is very much worth mimicking as scholars. Because I think Mark stands out as a scholar who has really and truly broken with the boundaries of academic fields. And actually illustrated by the way he writes, how to combine insights from various fields and disciplines. So he's I think a representative of a revolution against disciplinary sectarianism and isolationism. And then a third thing I just quickly want to highlight is which is also a dimension of Mark's scholarship, is his empathetic curiosity. So those of us who follow Mark on Facebook, we know exactly what I mean, because you will see pictures of Mark from all over the world, sipping coffee with all sorts of militant leaders around the world. But this, this curiosity I also remember as one of his advices to me when I was a PhD student and affiliated to the Uppsala Center for Global and International Studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where Mark was the director at that time. And he said to me when I was on my way to interview members and leaders of the Taliban movement in Pakistan, just to be open-minded and do my best to understand the perspective from where these militant actors were speaking. And then when I asked Mark about, okay, what exactly do you mean? It developed eventually into a conversation of what we have written about later in an edited volume on worldview analysis, or the social study of worldviews. My own contribution in the book is exactly on that. How do you actually immerse yourself into the worldview of those who you're trying to understand, and what are in fact the merits of such an approach that acknowledge that in this world we live in today, we have competing perceptions of the world. I will not go much into my own chapter, just refer to our website where it's open access and you can download the book. And I will pass the word already to our first speaker today, who has also been one of Mark's students, as far as I know. It's Reza Aslan, who's a scholar of religion, and also himself an author of several bestsellers, and he will share some points from his chapter on cosmic wars and social movements. Go ahead, Reza.
Thank you so much, Mona. Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here for this panel. I've been given 5 minutes to basically share my entire research, so I will speak at a very clipped pace here. I had the good fortune, as Mona said, of being one of Mark's students and having him as my dissertation advisor for a project that examined global jihadism through the lens of new social movement theories, which of course, being rooted in European traditions of social theory, tends to emphasize the centrality of collective action, collective identity in social protests. And then it also bases that identity less on class structure than on non-economic factors like race or age or ethnicity or gender or sexuality. In other words, identities that arise out of common or overlapping values. Now, at this time, I guess this was 2004, 2005. My memory is a little bit shot. This was a fairly untested way of thinking about global jihadism, the academic study of which tended to be very strictly siloed between the two distinct disciplines of either religious studies or sociology. However, with Mark's guidance, who happened to have a position in both of those fields, and certainly relying on his theory of cosmic war as a framework for understanding religious violence, I sought to bridge the gap between those two disciplines and outline an effective means for policymakers to understand and confront global jihadism at a time in which it was at the height of its influence around the world. By employing Mark's theory of cosmic war, I was able to essentially create a framework for understanding how religiously inclined social movements like global jihadism can overcome the central problem that's inherent in using violence to achieve, whatever their goals may be, and that is to organize and to ritualize that violence. In other words, to transform it into sacred violence, and then to use that shared act of sacred violence as a means of fostering collective identity across ethnic or frankly even religious divides. Now, just a quick explanation. So as a transnational social movement, one of global jihadism's greatest challenges is to link together all the individual identities of its members, regardless of their race or culture, ethnicity, nationality, whatever, under one single collective identity. And of course, the easiest way to do that is through what the sociologist William Ganson has called injustice framing, right? So you identify a situation as unjust, you assign blame for the injustice, you propose a radical solution for dealing with that injustice and also the people who are responsible for the injustice. And then finally, and most importantly, you connect that injustice to a larger frame of meaning so that you can communicate a uniform message that will resonate with as large a portion of the population as possible. This technique of frame alignment, obviously it allows social movements to more easily create in-groups and out-groups, right? It can help identify and also more importantly, vilify the enemy. It can assist movement leaders in making, in marking neutral bystanders as either sympathetic or antagonistic to the movement's cause. And all of this obviously has this larger aim of compelling people to join the movement and do something about their various grievances. So to put it in a simple way, the simplest way possible, framing helps members of a social movement make the difficult transition from collective identity to collective action. And then of course, by far, the easiest and most effective form of collective action is violence, especially the sacred violence that Mark describes in his theory of cosmic war, because sacred violence can transform complex, multi-pronged conflicts for which blame may be difficult to apportion into very simple very black and white conflicts for which blame is easy to assign. The obvious advantage of using cosmic war framing in this approach lies precisely in the emphasis that it allows on creating a reciprocal and dialectic relationship between collective identity and the formation of grievances, which to me was the key to truly understanding jihadism as a transnational movement. And so that obviously allowed me to pursue that project. And then I've since have used, some would say stolen Mark's ideas for most of my other projects. But just to end on a personal note, I had some difficulties in my PhD program. I was dealing with some personality conflicts, unfortunately, with some members of the faculty in my department, and had in fact quit the program at a certain point. I walked into the department and I said, "Thank you, everyone. I'm done," and I walked out before I was finished. And I remember very clearly sitting on a bench on campus, feeling terrible about having come so far and not having finished. And while I was sitting there, I felt a tap on my shoulder, and there was Mark. And I kind of explained to him that, well, I'm leaving. Actually, this is my final day on campus, and he told me not to worry. And he put his arm around my shoulder and he walked me over to his department. And he said, "From now on, you work with me." And so I owe so much more to Mark than just what he has given me as far as his academic and intellectual legacy. I, in many ways, owe my very academic career to Mark, and I couldn't be more grateful.
Thank you so much, Reza, for this introduction. And now we move over to next speaker, and that is Gillis Gunn. Gillis Gunn is from University of California, Santa Barbara, and is Distinguished Professor Emeritus in Global Studies and English, as well as Affiliate Professor at Religious Studies and Comparative Literature at the Department of Global Studies. Welcome, Gillis.
Thank you very much. Can you see me?
No, we can hear you. We can't see you.
Start my video. Here we go. Yep. Sorry about the delay. There we go.
5 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you. While my assignment for this book seemed to be fairly straightforward, it turned out to be anything but. The topic I was given was Marx's views on secularism. But Marx's views on secularism have evolved in relation to a variety of other topics he has been concerned with and have not followed a single track. Indeed, one of the pleasures of reading him derives from his ability to rethink issues by confronting them in different contexts. And then there is his equal gift for thinking against, or at least opposite, conventional understandings. The secular, for example, it is not, as is commonly regarded, religion's opposite, or even distant relative, and in fact may not even be, in the traditional sense, secular at all. As I have told the story in my brief essay, whenever Marx's reflections on this topic actually commenced, they became critical to the overall thrust of his work when he began to think about the scourge of global violence and asked himself where the responsibility for that violence might be. One of his initial answers, published in the New Cold War, was that it derived from the failures of state nationalisms that were supposedly established in the modern period to take over some of the roles of religion, but instead succeeded, too often, only in marginalizing religion or converting themselves into a substitute for it. A second came from his work on what he called the dark alliance between religion and violence in Terror and the Mind of God. They tended to shift, but by no means completely, the responsibility for global violence from the civil order to the religious. A third was to come more than a decade later in his book investigating how religious nationalisms confront the secular state, entitled Global Religion, when he discovered radical religious movements that were both nationalist and transnationalist in their responses to the new forces of a more globalized world, and in the process uncovered some elements of religious activism that were actually attempts to forge a post-Enlightenment social order with both nationalist and transnationalist characteristics. But a fourth was the result of a project chaired by Mark and sponsored by the Social Scientific Research Council that eventuated in the publication entitled Rethinking Secularism. In his own contribution, Mark explored the possibility of shifting the ground of the discussion about religion and secularism by reconsidering them as two competing rather than inevitably hostile frameworks of social order, essentially as ideologies that might offer possibilities of accommodation. Yet what sets Mark's analysis of this project apart from others is the way that he so very carefully examines it from every possible angle, concluding only that in what now appears to be a post-Enlightenment world, that there is at least some possibility, when liberated from some of their former historical relations, that religion and secular nationalism may yet be capable of functioning as allies in the formation of a less violent world. This prospect depends for Mark on whether and how, as ideologies of order, religion and secularity can address the underlying problems with which the modern loss of control and self-identity have left us. Mark is under no illusions about how difficult this task will continue to remain, but he nonetheless seems confident that if secular nationalism and radical religion have frequently been linked by means of violence, they have also functioned as constructs that provide an overarching framework of moral order, one that commands ultimate loyalty from those who subscribe to it, as he says. The question is whether, when one is pressured by the other, such constructs can resist the threat of being Manichaeanized, of turning their conflict into a battle between ultimate good and ultimate evil. Can either religion or the secular order keep from falling back on a cosmology centered around, as he puts it, cosmic war, which simultaneously absolutizes the conflict and demonizes the enemy? Mark seems more sanguine than some in believing that religious symbols and rituals can frequently diffuse such conflict, as well as legitimate it, which paradoxically, at least in relation to my title, makes religion possibly more than the secular order, as much the solution to violence as the cause of it. But only time will tell. But there is another possibility, I'd love to hear Mark on this one, that Mark's friend and colleague Ashish Nandy and various other theorists from the global south, Pankaj Mishra also often speaks for them, often propose. This alternative view is that the new geographies of violence in the contemporary world are not generated necessarily by those locked within the binary of the religious and the secular, but rather by those who feel shortchanged by and at the same time blocked out of global systems themselves, and preeminently those associated with the modernities created out of colonialism. Be they religious or secular, these global systems produce what Nandy calls regimes of narcissism and despair. Generating a kind of free-floating rage looking for targets, they also create what he terms dyadic bonds that bind both sides in a kind of lethally mutual hatred. The key difference from the more traditional religion-secularism conflict, to explain this violence, is that these dyadic bonds now create a link not so much between terror, religion, and the state, as between, more broadly, terror and culture itself. On the one hand, there are cultural stereotypes defining the social script that thwart and even condemn the possibility of intercultural understanding, much less of comedy. On the other, there is the natural political self-interest of cultures, whether religious or secular, that is, as Mark has long pointed out, inherently protective and obsessively self-regarding. When these two interests collide, they can produce the view that the use of terror, or at least of violence, is always justified because it is in fact only another kind of counter-terror or counter-violence. And the fight to fight the so-called other in any alternative way would be simply absurd. The fear of other cultures indeed often does breed panic as well as suspicion, when all rights to different versions of the future are subject to ridicule, disparagement, and subversion by, according to Nandy, the globally dominant systems. While this global world composed in so many instances of colonialist and post-colonialist modernities may not be the one we want, I'd love to know whether, in Mark's view, it is becoming any more predominant.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Giles. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Giles. And we will go to the next speaker now. And we have Mia Bloom, who is an international security fellow at the New America. And she has written a contribution on terrorism research and outbidding. Please go ahead, Mia.
Thank you. And thank you, Mona and Isak, for including me. I'm not sure if you can see me. I don't see myself. I only see Mona. I wanted to start where Reza left off and talk about the impact that Mark has on individual people, just at the most human level. For me, he was such a source of inspiration and continues to be a source of inspiration. So I was told I can't just spend my 5 minutes complimenting him, but I could probably spend 25 minutes complimenting him. The thing that amazes me about Mark, and I think this draws very nicely from the previous speaker, is that these distinctions about what constituted religious ideology or what constituted secular ideology, I think as a scholar, but also somebody who took their work and applied it in the real world, understood that these kinds of divisions were not exclusively fixed, and that they tended to, no pun intended, bleed one into another. One of the things that Mark, in his updates of Terror in the Mind of God, when he added this, which was so important, he wrote, "When I asked several of the Syrian refugees whether ISIS was motivated by religion or by power, they said power, but they used religion as an excuse for their authority." And I think that this sums up so beautifully the false dichotomies that we create as academics between something as either secular or it's religious, when in fact, the reality of this is that there are going to be elements, it's more like a spectrum upon which you have the ideal types, but reality is so much more messy than, the ideal types that we use, and we organize our principles as we proceed in one academic discipline or the other. For me, this idea that even secular groups or groups that are not purely religious can cloak themselves with the veil of authenticity of religion in order so that their messages resonate with the rank and file, I thought was absolutely spot on, and reflects, I think, a little bit of what we don't see as much in political science, but we certainly see in sociology. People like Jeff Goodwin from NYU have said very comparable things. And so it's very important that as we understand the possibility of secular groups invoking religion almost as a crutch or as a justification for what they do, we also can see that secular groups have an almost religious cult-like adherence by their members to the leadership. And so, we could have these arguments that the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, were clearly a secular group. They included Tamils along the religious spectrum. You didn't need to be a particular religious individual to be part of the LTTE, but the way and the manner in which they treated Prabhakaran, Velupillai Prabhakaran, which was the leader up until he was killed, was certainly, no dissimilar than Ashoka Asahara, who was the leader of the cult in Japan. And so what you have then is this ability to understand that the way in which you motivate people in their hearts and minds can offer the kinds of behaviors likened to a religion, whether it's a religious group or not. There's also the fact that, anything can be justified if you put the veil of authenticity and you call it religious doctrine. Certainly explains to us why so many, at least, of Daesh or ISIS's targets, the victims of ISIS, we tended to see far more Muslims than we ever saw non-Muslims, but also we saw Muslims, not just Shia Muslims, but Muslims that didn't agree with ISIS. And so in this way, ISIS has the ability to redraw the parameters of the in-group and the out-group and who they then designated as being the appropriate religious interpretation or not. The second thing that I wanted to say, and again, just as a source of inspiration, Mark was one of the earliest people to recognize that when there were multiple groups in any kind of conflict setting, there was naturally a kind of competition between the groups. And this again is what inspired my own work on outbidding, that the groups would then see the other potential rivals as also as enemies, not just that they were rivals, because they were very often sharing the same ideology, ethnicity, language, history, and that in having these outbidding scenarios, we would see the escalation of violence ratcheting it up. And we used to call that in IR the security dilemma, or Barry Posen would call it the ethnic security dilemma. But for Mark, he definitely understood and appreciated that groups very often were protective of their own spheres of influence, and that a rival was more dangerous in some ways than the designated enemy. And I thought that that was also very important to understand, that, you know, these kinds of violent actions that are perpetrated by terrorist groups, they don't soften their approach if it's members of their own community. They're not going to let off easy other Muslims if it's jihadi groups. And so whether a group is secular or religious, we're going to see these ideologies that are marking the insiders and the outsiders, the us versus the them. And this is one of Mark's greatest gifts to our academic study, is to be able to understand that just because we have these different dichotomies in our subfields or in our fields of study, that the reality is so much more meaningful, nuanced, and messy. And it's the messiness that I thank Mark for, as well as the fact that I've always paid very close attention to him as a source of emulation, that we should not be navel gazing and just looking at our research for the sake of research, but that our research ultimately should be used to help people and to give back to the community, not just to scholars and other people who are going to cite the work, but actually help the people who are most impacted by this violence and terrorism. And so for this, Mark, I thank you enormously, and I'm honored to be in such a wonderful group. I thank Mona and Isak for including me.
Thank you so much, Mia. So next speaker is Gurinder Singh Man, who serves as director of the Global Institute for Sikh Studies in New York, as well as manager of the Journal of Sikh and Punjab Studies. So please, Gurinder, and mute yourself.
Okay. So can you all see me and hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Good.
5 minutes.
Thank you very much for making me part of this great event. And as you know, people have said before, this shows Mark's humanity. And in a way, how many people relate to the vision of global studies? I come from Sikh studies. And when I sat down to put my remarks together, the sort of one single argument in my mind was how much a substantial scholar can bring to a nascent field of Sikh studies. How much he has done for the field. And I was just would earmark the sort of different layers. First and foremost, the most important event in the past 4 or 5 decades in Sikh history was the Operation Blue Star. And Mark has introduced that to more students than all other programs put together in the Western world. So whether he was teaching his global studies course or whatever, more people have come to understand the nature of Operation Blue Star and what went into that from Mark's classes than any other person or campus I can think of. The story doesn't sort of end there. He built that up, and he is the only scholar we have who created a different paradigm than the Chicago fundamentalism project. I mean, the way he explained the happenings in Sikh history in the past some decades, that model is yet to filter down to Sikh leadership and the Sikh community, because his books don't have Sikh in the title. So the Sikhs hardly read books, and they only read books where there is specifically mentioned. So I think in the days ahead, I'll have to think how to take that message, whether to translate that in Punjabi or what to do that. Now, moving on, he has opened up new areas of research. Some 4 decades ago, when he was at Berkeley, he started thinking about Sikh studies, and within the Sikh community and Sikh scholars, nobody had heard of what you call the migration studies. He introduced the discussion about migration studies. Migration studies turned into the diaspora studies turned into the global studies. And he has done brilliant work as his own thinking evolved. So a field is given, the scholars are taken by almost, he guided them to say, hey guys, here is a chapter that needs to be addressed too, that needs to be thought about. And then again, remember please, my argument was that how much a substantial scholar can bring to a field, which may be one of his sort of side fields, is of minor interest to him. So when he was building his program of religious studies at UC Berkeley, he created, he created the sort of contours of the fields of Sikh studies. What should be there? And I have always been intrigued about the way he structured it, the way he laid it out. But this morning, when I was thinking about the presentation, it occurred to me that when we thought of doing the Brill Encyclopedia of Sikhism, actually, without consciously thinking about Mark's discussion in the late 70s, we lifted the structure that he had created. So there are things which people know about Mark's work. There are things which they have just absorbed and don't even think where they have come from. And that is what his contribution to the field is. And then there's something very interesting. And speaking personally, grew up in India in the 1960s. And as all of us sort of thought of English literature, we found fascinating. An average Indian can quote more of a romantic poetry than a graduate of an American university. I can promise you that. And so working on that track, I did my master's in English, and lo and behold, my essay was on the wasteland, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. Just to imagine a kid growing up in Uppsala, struggling with the wasteland, word by word, whatever. I did it, got my degree. And then I go back home and I come across this book. That's Mark's book. He put together a conference in 1977 and took out a book. And I read the book and read his essay, The Forgotten Tradition, Sikhism in the World Religions. And I sort of sat back and thought, what the heck? What am I doing with the wasteland? Well, here is the green land, which might be able to put together by, where I can use my talents in a more effective way than having to worry about the wasteland and the boredom of T.S. Eliot. I was never bored in India. You are never bored. Nobody would leave you alone to be bored, even if you want to be. So 79, this book took me to a track, and I never looked back. And Mark Saab, as I have always addressed him, I love that title. So it's not Professor Juergensmeyer, but it's Mark Saab. Thank you. Thank you very much. And at this point, I'll just leave you with one request. 4 decades ago, you said the Sikhs are a forgotten tradition. Now they may not be a forgotten tradition. I think more books are written in the past half century than in the previous 4 centuries, but the issue still remains whether they are accurately represented or not. Forgotten they are not, but are they accurately represented or not? And I would request you that in the blissful days ahead, please keep us in your reflections, and we will be very grateful on behalf of myself, my family, and my community. I think I have earned that behalf of my community too. Thank you for all you have done for us. And please don't forget us as you enjoy the beautiful days ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gurinder, for that nice presentation. I just have a quick piece of service information that, of course, Mark will speak by the end of this webinar and have the opportunity to comment on every one of the presentations. But we're eating a bit from the last point, which is the Q&A and conversation point at on the schedule. So all of you are actually more than welcome to write in the chat already now if you have any comments or questions. And I also just want to say that please be informed that the session here is recorded and will be available on the DIIS website from tomorrow. We will now move on to the global studies field, and we have a presentation by Richard Applebaum, who is also a distinguished professor emeritus in global and international studies, one of Mark's good old colleagues, and he will speak a bit about his chapter on the creation of global studies.
Thank you, Mona and Isaac and Gurinder for your absolutely beautiful introduction. In the spirit of your comments on Mark's role in the creation of Sikh studies, I thought I'd focus on Mark's role in the creation of global studies out of the wasteland, so to speak, both at UCSB and globally. This was an enterprise that he, Giles, and I shared with great passion over many, many years. But in the keeping with the spirit of this Festschrift, I thought I would cast my talk in religious terms. So the title of my chapter and talk is A Prophetic Voice, Mark Juergensmeyer and the Creation of Global Studies. And I will be very brief. I have 4 biblical chapters here with a little personal coda. Chapter 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That's from Genesis 1:1. So a mere 5,754 years later, according to the Hebrew calendar, that would be in 1993, Mark arrived at UC Santa Barbara. As it turned out, the creation of global studies took much longer than 6 days. An academic Senate committee had already called for the creation of a school of global studies, but our chancellor at the time dismissed the idea as lacking sizzle. Mark then appeared. He came from the University of Hawaii, where he had been dean of the School of Hawaiian, Asian, and Pacific Studies, which gave him the experience and the cred to create sizzle. He also possessed the prophetic voice. His book predicting that there would be a new Cold War between religious nationalism and the secular state, which was incredibly prescient at the time, was published the year he arrived at UCSB. Now, here's a fun fact for you all to think about. Mark claims that his prophetic skills were honed at youthful revival meetings in Carlinville, Illinois, population 5,500, where he was born and grew up. Now, I've never been able to independently verify that any of this actually occurred, that he actually attended a revival meeting, but I will say that when he and I co-taught global studies, to make a point, he occasionally would shout out, "Hallelujah," to the amusement of all the students. Chapter 2, you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly. That's from James 4:3. Mark Giles and I teamed together to push for global studies, but we must have asked wrongly because after countless committee meetings, instead of a school in 1995, we got a small program with Mark as a director. And I occasionally wonder if Mark's prophetic voice might have jangled a few nerves. I know Mark and Giles will clearly remember a meeting where Mark prophesied that global studies future was key to UCSB's salvation, after which we were denounced for trying to create a global juggernaut. Those were the exact words that would devour everything on campus. Mark then took the lead in writing a proposal for a global studies major. And what I mainly remember about that activity was that he used WordStar, which even at the time was an archaic word processing program that made it impossible for anyone to edit his ideas, which turned out to be fortunate because a major was approved in 1999, the first global studies major in the country. It grew overnight to almost 1,000 students and several times is rated the most popular on campus. Mark created many converts with his charismatic teaching to large intro classes. Chapter 3, ask and it will be given to you, and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. That's from Matthew. In our unending quest for a professional school, Mark Giles and I knocked on many doors that we somehow failed to notice were all labeled death by committee. Yet when it just seemed that our effort was doomed, Mark knocked on the right door, that of Kinko's founder, Paul Uppsala. Somehow during fall 2004, Mark's hallelujah got through to Paul, who promised a $10 million endowment for MAGIS, a Master's in Global and International Studies. I point out to you that our students were thereafter called Magi, which also somehow seemed appropriate. I took the lead in writing the proposal for the graduate program. I did not use WordStar, which now sailed through all the necessary committees. In academia, nothing illuminates a program's intellectual integrity, not to mention its sizzle, better than a $10 million gift. 12 years after we began our desert wanderings, a semi-professional graduate program was created, our holy grail. Chapter 4, final chapter, quote, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. That's from, appropriately from Mark, chapter 16, verse 15. Mark, I didn't know that you contributed to the gospel, but apparently that's the case. As the founding director of the Uppsala Center, Mark went truly global in spreading the gospel, creating an amazing range of projects, conferences, publications, speakers, and residencies for former ambassadors and visiting scholars. He launched a key affiliation with the European Union's Erasmus Mundus program, and with Helmut Anheier co-edited the 4-volume, 2,000-page Encyclopedia of Global Studies. And when Gurinder brought out his books, I went over to get my 4 volumes, but they were too heavy for me to bring to the table. He created the Global Studies Consortium, a worldwide network of programs offering global studies graduate degrees, which leads me to my coda. One final quote from Isaiah this time. The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness. What was once a voice in the wilderness is now heard around the globe. There are now more than 300 undergraduate and graduate programs in the United States that serve thousands of undergraduate majors and graduate students, and numerous similar programs in Asia and Europe. Mark's skills at institution building, his unflaggingly positive attitude, and his amazing prophetic ability to work a crowd, honed at those revival meetings he claimed he suffered through as a child, clearly paid off. Mark, my good friend, collaborator, and co-conspirator, hallelujah.
Thank you so much, Richard. Next on the list, we have many here that wants to speak. So next on the list is Margot Kitts, who is a professor of humanities and religious studies at Hawaii Pacific University and have been contributing with the chapter on the cosmic wars. Please, Margot.
Yes, so I think I'm going to do something a little different here. So here goes. Before 9/11, the Oklahoma City bombing, white nationalist marches on Charlottesville and DC, and the clamors of identity advocates all over the world, Mark wrote The New Cold War, Religious Nationalism Confronts the Secular State. To say it was prescient is to put it lightly. Today, the topic of religious violence is on fire in popular discourse, fueled in part by the profusion of nationalist groups proclaiming religious roots and religious phobias, as well as acting upon them. He expanded his approach to religious violence in a number of volumes on terrorism, such as Terror in the Mind of God and God at War. His influence on the field is indelible. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Mark's thinking is his emphasis on religious imagination, which he takes seriously. Based on interviews with activists, he claims that imagination is not immaterial, but rather a driving force for much religious violence. This is verifiable in my own studies, which concern both very ancient and very contemporary religious thinking. I can't cover both cosmic war and atavistic longings here, so I'll stick to a form of cosmic war, the chaos comp, for which I can share visuals that may be new to some of you. So the chaos comp motif refers to narratives and art which illustrate the overcoming of chaos through divine violence, for which Mark assigned the name cosmic war. Although some religious activists today eagerly anticipate an eschaton when God will defeat the forces of chaos and restore order, the motif has roots also in the ancient Near East, where it can be identified by struggles among sea monsters and storm gods. The theme is apparent from the Babylonian Enuma Elish to Hittite Ulukumi myth to the mythic triumph of Ugaritic Baal over Yam and biblical Yahweh over Yam and Leviathan, the sea. All herald the victory of celestial storm gods over opposing divinities or monsters, often with aqueous characteristics. Scholars of the chaos comp argue that, along with various hybrid creatures, sea monsters and disorderly waters represent a state of darkness, confusion, and lifelessness, says John Day of West Semitic Conceptions. The power of chaos, rebellion, or evil, says Michael Fishbane of Biblical Conceptions. Or the ever-emergent dangers of this life, says Nick Wyatt. Such monsters are represented as threats, presumably because of their watery capacity to submerge terrestrials and their tendency for hybridity and discomfiting liminality. Dragons, for instance, rampage on land, in air, and sea. At the very least, they suggest a cosmic instability in need of remediation. So I want to show you some evidence from ancient times, from ancient Near East, on cylinder seals. So this one, for instance, this is supposed to be Marduk or Ninurta slaying the monster Tiamat, depicted as a snake here. And this is from somewhere between the 9th and the 7th centuries BCE. This is from Dominic Cullen's First Impressions. It's nonetheless, you know what I love about this? Check out these drums over here. I think this was a bardic tradition that's being represented here. Cosmic combat is one of the oldest tropes in art, like this Mesopotamian cylinder seal from the 3rd millennium BC, this from the Met. Check out these gods who are duking it out. And you know they're gods because they have their mush, that's what we called it in Sumerian, or Milamu and Akkadian, coming from their heads, like, I don't know, an aura or halo or something. Here's another one where, this is Ea, by the way, I think that's his vizier. And this is supposed to be the Anzu bird biting the head of some fallen god. I don't know who he is, but you can see there's conflict in these very ancient representations. So sea monsters, way prevalent. Here's one that represents a hydra whose heads are being severed by some apparently gods. And this is pretty classic. And here's another one very similar. This is supposed to be Ninurta slaying a monster with 7 heads, but it could be Baal or Yahweh. Just could be whatever you want, because they don't come with tags. All right, so this one I think is worth pointing out that this is a theme we see in Psalm 74, where it says, "It was you who split open the sea by your power, you who broke the heads of the monsters in the waters, you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it its food to the creatures of the desert, you who opened up springs and streams and dried up the ever-flowing rivers." So we have countless depictions of gods brandishing weapons. And I think you should know that the theme continues into Greek antiquity and even into early Christian mythology, like 4th, 5th century. Smith, Braque, and Grieg are wonderful on this. And the point here is that Mark put his finger on a violence which is primordial in religious imagination. So what is the appeal? Although most of us would not expect demons to pose as supernatural threats now, the triumphal rhetoric associated with the Chaos Kampf has continued to be discernible in eschatological expectations among fringe religious groups and in the terroristic binary thinking that Mark identified as cosmic war. So we see triumphal hopes among Islamic State, even the anarchist Boogaloo Boys and Proud Boys, in that they anticipate some kind of extraordinary real world cataclysm followed by some great religious revival. So I just put up some. What is the appeal? Is this just about stabilizing a chaotic reality or taming some kind of imminent disorder? Why is this such a prevalent theme? It's like world creating, actually, that's what Michael Fishbane would say. Or is it simply thrilling to imagine the gods at war, defeating watery demons? And of course, the big question is, does narrative violence justify war on the ground? Well, the Assyrian and Hittite royal annals absolutely do mimic some of this rhetoric, right? Gods marching in front. I think that's my 5 minutes because I timed it before. So I hope you can see that.
Thank you so much, Margot. And now we actually have our last presentation before we give the word to Mark. And Hagen Schulz-Forberg, who is an associate professor at Aarhus University, will talk a bit about his chapter on transnational studies of conceptual change.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Hello, can you see me, hear me? I can't. Yes, all good. Well, thank you so much for all the presentations and for having me on board. It is a real privilege. And for once, I am very happy that I'm not in the same room with Mark, because we would probably start joking and go for go for a beer and talk about this and that. But it gives me at least 5 minutes to be a bit more serious about all the intellectual achievements that Mark has achieved in his life and reached all the goals, man, in institution building and writing books and the humanity that he spreads. Now, it's been deeply influential to me in my thinking over the last decade, even though probably you didn't know Mark because we were spending time cracking jokes about this and that. But secretly, when we were not having fun, I was reading up on your reading list, which grew faster than I could even catch up with the reading. So that was just amazing. Now, I got to know Mark in 2008 at one of those Global Studies Consortium meetings that Richard mentioned, and immediately I was fascinated by the whole idea of the Global Studies Consortium, which Mark impersonated to such a fantastic degree, in an open-mindedness, an open-heartedness, and an embrace of every perspective possible. Now, as Mona mentioned at the very beginning, one of the things that she learned from Mark as a PhD student was that when you go out and talk to those religious activists or to those interviewees that you want to engage with, stay open-minded, try to take their perspective very seriously, and try to reach not to overcome your prejudice, your kind of worldview that you bring as a researcher, and try to take those speech acts as legitimate as they are, take them on an equal basis. And that's what Mark did, also in the Global Studies Consortium, whether our colleagues came from Moscow or China, and they brought very different viewpoints on global studies. You remember the Russian idea of globalistics, and whether they also brought a very strong vodka drinking culture to the agenda or a very strong Chinese. It didn't matter at all. Mark would sit through and we would try to find, a humorous platform on which to connect those Russians, in some way. And so the institution was able to still grow. I mean, Lomonosov is still part of the Global Studies Consortium, and the Shanghai University keeps trying to be, the host of everything. So all of this, I think, is because you, Mark, also gave so much of your personality and your warm-heartedness into this organization. But it was also the time in 2008 that I was grappling with my own efforts at trying to write something like a theoretical or methodological summary or approach to a project which I was engaged in called Global Conceptual History. Now, I'm not a student of anything religious, but reading Mark, I thought, man, he's right. He's on the right track. He's just doing what I'm doing, only that he's not doing what I'm doing. But somehow he's also doing exactly what I'm doing. First of all, trying to understand these cosmic wars, religious challenges of the secular state as something that Reza called a social movement, a political movement, a social imagination. And here I would like to enter something that adds on Mona's perspective, the methodology of taking each of those voices on an equal par, and Reza's contribution that said, well, these are really social movements that project social imaginations, create identities, create commonalities, also create otherness, right? But what my point is, and what drives me, is that how do they do this? They do this by creating, variations of legitimacies, new social imaginaries that are radical alternatives. And in order to do that, they need to write different histories. It's time, right? So I really like to think in temporalizations. So these radical alternatives that I read throughout in Mark's work, the concepts that are mobilized by these religious activists, they propose a radical alternative to the present, but all of this is because they create radically different temporalizations, right? This is not only is history rewritten in those narratives, but also the very timelessness. So the fundamental concepts on which societies are built, social orders refer to, the normativities on which we built our constitutions, in the Western world, they were mostly rewritten after the Second World War, for example, on notions of human inviolability or human rights. Now, these religious alternatives, they do a similar thing, but only they inscribe very different fundamental normative concepts towards which we should strive and towards which we should act. So I was always wondering, when I read Mark, let me try to share, I hope I'm not sharing any of my the wrong slide here. So when I was thinking together with Mark's writings about what am I doing, modernity, I thought he was grappling with something that is also a fundamental theoretical conundrum with one of my favorite historians. His name was Reinhard Koselleck, who came up with a book called Critique and Crisis. That is, the fundamental, what makes modernity is not necessarily a diversification of society and a kind of a, ever ongoing process and division of labor and this kind of liberal capitalist narrative. But what Koselleck came up with was that it's fundamentally the rebirth of critique, and critique ultimately temporalizes as it destabilizes and undermines the present or something that is hegemonic at the time, right? And I found that this was extremely interesting to then translate into an approach for writing global history. So we came up with global conceptual history. And while we were looking at concepts about society and economy and how those concepts work differently in different languages and were contested and interpreted by different agents across Asia, Mark is doing a similar thing to my mind, which I think is fundamentally important, that he takes those concepts which are contested, what is democracy? What is the real representation of people? What is the real representation of fundamental values? Where the Western world, the secular world becomes this hegemonic enemy against which a critique and an alternative is projected, very much in a modern sense. This is how, you know, where much of the dynamics of changes of legitimacy come from in modern history. The constant challenge, the constant relation between critique and crisis, you know, yields dystopian and utopian languages. And here, Mark's work for me is fundamentally important, as such conceptual contestations are really crucial for understanding today and bringing together, you know, religious studies and religious concept as social imagination, and thus not as something that is completely opposite to, you know, a secular narrative, which is so old school these days. You know, the secular narrative would exclude religion as being in another time, you know, way back then in the past. That's so old school, that's so traditional. No, it's not. It's right here, right in the middle of things, as, you know, those fundamental concepts remain deeply contested and create, you know, conflict along the way. So Mark has not only given his warm-heartedness, he's also given a very a very good method, which it took me a long time to get my head around this and write a very complicated theoretical introduction. And then I had the chance to talk to Mark about it the other day when you were giving this great talk at Aarhus. I was like, how do you do it, Mark? This whole method? And he said, well, I like beer, you know? So his sticker is that he goes, do you remember that? You know, he goes out and talks to journalists and just meets the people and is able to embrace the other perspective and then collect it and come up with these deeply informed, deeply educated, well-written, easily accessed books, which to my mind are a model of how we should do global studies as a performance of transnational conceptual change. I think these were my 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you so much, Hagen. And now these are just teasers of what you can find in the book. There are 22 contributions. You have listened to 7 of them, so there are 15 more contributions in the book. And the book, as Mona said, it's available, it's free of charge. To honor Mark, it's not behind any paywalls, so it can be widely distributed. We have sent the link here in the chat function. And now we want to turn to Mark and to give you a chance to reflect on these presentations, on the book, and on the theme of religion, conflict, and global society. Mark.
Well, what a wonderful occasion this is, and what an interesting conversation. And I know Mona said that this would be my opportunity to respond to each one of these presentations. You don't want to hear that, because that's going to be taking the rest of the day, because each one of these presentations is so interesting and it raised so many interests. You know, I was, you know how you're talking to the television sometimes when you hear something going on and you want to immediately jump up and respond? Well, that's the way I felt about each one of these presentations. I want to say something about that. And so I will with each of the speakers afterwards, I'm sure, in some kind of context. But I just want to say in general, I know this is supposed to be in some ways an appreciation of my work, but it's really been an appreciation of the work of each one of the contributors. As you heard people speaking, you understand how significant their own work is and how much I've learned from them. And we really are, in academia in general, a collaborative institution. We learn so much from each other. We work together. It's not just that we run into each other and we drink beer at conferences, but we imbibe each other's ideas as well and grow and expand from them. So nothing that I've done could have been done without the people that you've seen on the screen today and the many others that are represented in this book and the many others around the world. So I am deeply grateful to all of you, and we celebrate together the kind of achievements of academic collaboration. Having said that, let me just say a word about what I'm doing now and what I'm going to be doing next, and then we'll run to the discussion. As Isak said, I've been a part of their this project on jihadist movements and how they come to an end, which has been wonderful for me because again, I've gotten to learn from so many interesting collaborators who've been involved in this project. But my own work on this has been focused on 3 case studies: ISIS in Iraq, the Punjab Khalistan movement in India, and the Moro movement in the Philippines, trying to understand how they come to an end. And so the culmination was supposed to be 1 book. It got to be so huge, it turned out to be 2 books. And 1 book is already out called God at War, a meditation on religion and violence. And that book sets the groundwork, because as I was thinking about how to talk about the ending of these movements, I had to understand what they are and how religion functions in relationship to the kind of warlike position that these movements have taken. And so that's what that book is, to explore the creative imagination of the human spirit that is able to think both in terms of religion as an alternative reality and to think of war as an alternative reality, and how these 2 constructions of the human imagination, war and religion, compete with each other, but also reinforce each other. And so then that guided me in the concluding book on how religious violence ends, this title, When God Stops Fighting, with a subtitle, How Religious Violence Ends, focusing on these 3 case studies of ISIS and the Khalistan movement and the Moro movement in the Philippines, how they've come to an end, each in a different way and not quite ending really, because one of the things I've discovered is often this image of cosmic war, the great struggle, the great battle that have animated people to be involved in these movements in the first place doesn't easily dissipate. They may stop fighting, and for that we're enormously grateful. And usually for us, that's enough. As long as they're not trying to kill each other or kill us, people can believe any crazy thing that they want to. And they do. The image of struggle continues, but what interested me was the different ways in which that image is contained and is maybe reverts to its role within religious imagination and not in political imagination. So that's the project that I've been working on now, God at War, which just came out, both in German by Herder in a German translation, and in English by Oxford University Press. And then When God Stops Fighting will be out at the end of the year, the beginning of next year, with the University of California Press. And then what next? Well, I'm going to be fading off to Maui and also continuing to be half the year in California. I'm not disappearing, obviously, and my wife has retired for over 15 years, and she's enormously productive academically, continue to work on books, and of course, I'll do the same thing. And what books? I think I continue my search for understanding the role of religion in global civil society, in both destructive and I hope also positive ways, and exploring a theme at the end of God at War, which is also a theme that was in an earlier book, God of the Tumult of the Global Square, about the possibilities of religion in creating a kind of a religious civil society, a religious global civil society, the role that religion can play in helping to heal humanity as well as to harm humanity. I'd like to turn my attention to that in some way, and we'll see how that develops. I'm sure all case studies will be, I like talking with people, but also thinking about things, and those will be the projects for the future. So thank you everybody for this enormously interesting discussion. I hope I've left at least a few minutes for comments and for our discussion together. So Mona and Isak, take it away.
Thank you, Mark. We have actually opened up for the opportunity to post questions in the chat function, but all of you panelists are also welcome to enter into a conversation with Mark or pose some questions. But I'll just start off with one question that I have since you are now perhaps using more time relaxing in the future. So if you were to give like 3 good pieces of advice to the community or the scholarly community dealing with conflict research, global studies, and religious violence, what would that advice be? So if you have in mind, the disciplines and how the, disciplinary logics are within peace and conflict studies, within global studies and religious violence, would you like to see these disciplines move in some specific kind of direction, or do you see them being blind for, have some blind spots as a general tendency? Or do you have some good advice for people, and particularly perhaps young researchers who are starting their careers as academics?
Sure, as an academic, I'm full of advice. Probably the first one I would give is don't start off with a theory and look for things to support it. This is a favorite device of graduate students who are, desperate to latch onto something that will help them kind of explain the world and then go out and find data to support it. That, to my mind, is lazy thinking. You don't learn anything from that. You just take some other idea, somebody else's idea, and you kind of footnote it. What I would rather people do is to try to discover new things. And Mona, as you and I have frequently discussed, one of the best ways to do that is go and talk with people. Try to enter other people's mind. I mean, sometimes you can't actually physically talk with them, but as Margot has shown in her own works, which is dealing with ancient literature, you could enter into the minds of ancient thinkers through literature and through the kind of work they've done to try to recreate the worldviews that animate them and the social imagination that makes their own world possible and explains why they do the things that they do. So it's what's really exciting and fun about the academic project is to ask questions that we don't know the answers to. And then it becomes detective work. It becomes as interesting and exciting as a murder mystery, trying to find out who did it and why. And then trying to adapt the methods, to adapt the theories to relate to the problem that we're trying to solve, to make sense with the dilemma that we're trying to understand. I think that's probably the main advice I'd give. Be bold. Don't be afraid to ask questions that you don't know the answers to. That's what the academic life is all about.
So I have a question. I actually have 2 questions I don't know the answer to. Well, I have many. One is your work, Mark.
I love your biblical references, by the way. Rich, is the first time I knew you to actually have read the Bible. Somebody must have given those quotes to you.
Mark, there's so much you don't know about me. I go to Torah study now every Saturday for an hour and a half. So here's one question, serious question. Your work and the work of this panel really focuses on the intersection of religion and violence, and religion generally. My own work, as you know, focuses on economics, economic globalization, workers' rights, the rise of China, inequality. Do you see the two? How can the two be brought together? And my other question, you can choose one or the other to answer in the interest of time. If God stops fighting, is that because globalization may have reached a turning point and returning now to geopolitics, the rise of nations, borders, global conflict, which will be a return to fighting a Cold War among secular states, as opposed to global wars of religious nature?
2 very good questions. First of all, on the first, if you think of religion as a product of human imagination and as a kind of a construction of a worldview, then it's terribly relevant to economics and the economic life, because after all, any kind of material pursuit is also a part of a constructed imaginary world in which you gives you a kind of location and a reason for doing what you do. And sometimes religion can support that. And sometimes, as Marx noted, it can be an instrument of change. And his Marx's analysis of the peasant movement showed that it can be a rebellious, statement against authority. And we talked about—
I read the Bible, you read Marx. You're telling me you read Marx?
I read your Bible. So religion can be not just an opium, but also the sigh of the oppressed, which is so different, because the sigh is an expression of oppression, and to see religion that way makes a huge difference. So yes, the two can be compatible. Is globalization bringing religious violence to an end?
No, my question was a little different. It was our pursuit of global studies and globalization. There's now a lot of evidence that countries are turning inward, geopolitics is rising, competition between the US and China, globally bringing industries back home. Are we returning to the old Cold War? And what's the implication of that for religion?
Well, I'm not sure the old Cold War ever really ended, and there are new forms of Cold War emerging. It's certainly not the same as the old, and religion has a role in it. I mean, part of the rise of neo-nationalism, of course, is religious neo-nationalism. And one of the things that I'm frequently called upon to talk about right now is the rise of religious nationalism, Christian nationalism, and its relationship to the Proud Boys and QAnon, and other forms of strident neo-nationalism in the United States. Well, it's consistent with what's been going around the world since I first started working on this topic over 30 years ago. It's the same ingredients, the same elements. So in that sense, it hasn't changed. The new forms of neo-nationalism are, again, religious challenges to the secular state. The real question is there going to be a turning, an inflection point when these kind of neo-nationalisms are really the last gasp of nationalistic fervor before people begin to relax into a global identity and a global structure of humanity. And that'll take some time because we don't have the instruments of globality. We don't have the architecture of global authority and global governance. The United Nations, in its own fragile way, is providing some of that, but it's going to have to do a lot more until people feel secure in this globalized world and they can accept all of the benefits of globalization and of multicultural societies, which, at least in California, makes our lives so rich and interesting and society so productive. And I think this is, I think I'm almost saying that California is the future, and I'd like to imagine that. But I think there is a global future ahead for all. That's my optimistic hope beyond the current tensions of today.
Thank you, Mark. I see that Mia has a comment.
Oh, I had a question. So
question,
because
sorry.
I just to be controversial, just to be different today than I usually am. Mark, so here's my question. Yeah. There has been discussions, I don't want to call it yet a movement, that criticizes field research, that if you are not of a particular society, there's a sort of, cultural imperialism to go into a global South country and do the research. And so I was curious, you now have the opportunity of a career long of experiences. You yourself are not Sikh, you studied Sikhs, you're not a Muslim, you studied Islam and radical Islam. I was curious, what do you think about that? Is a movement with this sort of young generation that you can't study something if you're not from it?
Well, I think that's ridiculous, of course. I mean, just ask Reza what it's like to be challenged on Fox News about why a Muslim is reading a book about Christ, and he answered very sensibly, I'm not writing as a Muslim, I'm writing as a scholar, which is a wonderful answer. And I think it's the answer that all of us give. I remember years ago was question about whether you could study Judaism if you weren't Jewish. Could you study Islam if you weren't Muslim? Well, of course you can. It also means that more Muslims should be studying Christianity. It means more, more Jews should be studying Sikhism. We need to understand the larger complexity of humanity. It also is true that if you're in a particular religious tradition or a culture, you bring a certain body of knowledge, a sensitivity to it, are able to report, and that makes your research potentially a lot more interesting. It also can make it potentially more trivial, because if you don't question your own assumptions, you can simply parrot the culture of which you're a part, but it can also make it much more rich. So I think both things are true, that you need to have people from a tradition studying deeply their own tradition, and you need to have the voices for those who are not a part of the tradition. The real trick is to get them in the same room. And so people are talking together, not past each other.
Thank you, Mark. I can just see that we have a hand raised from one of the contributors to the book, Ronki Ram, but I'm not sure if we can see him or hear him. So if we can't, then it would be great if you can just write your question or comment in the chat. Oh, we can. Yeah, great.
Professor Mark, this is a great celebrations of your book. I can see it from different corners of the world. My question is, at this moment, I don't want to ask a question, but still it's very interesting to find your views on this. How do you find the people to whom you studied? They think about your work, and the scholars who read you, who interact with you, because I understand when you visit Punjab, the Dalits of this region, they look at you as, the one who is giving them the voice, and they have a lot of love for you. So how would you distinguish your respondents, about whom you write, and you make your theories and your own work in that context? Because field and the study are two different domains.
Okay, one last and final response to that, because we need to draw the seminar to an end. But please, Mark.
Yeah, Professor Ronki Ram studies Dalits, the former people formerly called untouchables in Punjab. And he recently wrote a very nice article in the Ambedkar Times, crediting me for helping inspiring him. Because my dissertation research about, yikes, over 50 years ago, was in the Punjab on religious movements and untouchable, movements that were religious, but also socially progressive and political. It's kind of like the Black Muslims in the United States, where religion was their means of reconceiving society, the kind of thing I've been talking about all of my life, religious imagination, creating a new worldview in which people are all equal. There are no castes, there's no hierarchy. And I was attracted to this because it's so enormously innovative. It's so imaginative that people, particularly in this kind of oppressed situation, could use their intellectual resources to really recreate an alternative world. And so my interviews with them was with enormous respect, and I still have just the greatest of respect to my Dalit colleagues. Ronki Ram knows that I was just there a little over a year or so ago visiting my old friends that I met 50 years ago. Those are still around. And so impressed with the way in which they developed their community, and they've developed their own resources in a way that they were certainly now taken with a great deal of seriousness and equality in a way that they weren't, many years ago. I think each of this gets back to Mona's question. It really helps if you not only are interested in people, but if you respect them and you admire what they're trying to do. Even the most awful people in ISIS, you know, talking with people who have supported ISIS. Yeah, I hate what they're doing terrible things, but they were trying to empower the Sunni Arabs in Western Iraq and Eastern Syria, who have been so dismissed and treated as second-class citizens. And that part you can admire and you can appreciate. And I think we need to look for what people do, for the positive aspects of what people do, even in the most awful circumstances, and even when they do the most horrible things. And that may be the good place on which to end. Thank you very much, Isak and Monique, for convening this celebration together. I've appreciated it.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we draw this to an end now. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Please get the book if you're interested to continue to read. So thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank
Goodbye.
you all. Thank you, Mark. Congratulations.
Thank you for making this happen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful.